Today I want to talk about the George Floyd situation and what happened after that. Now, first of all, I want to talk about George Floyd and how terrible that whole situation was. I watched the video, and watching that officer sit on his neck for 8-9 minutes and stay on his neck when he wasn't moving was terrible and horrible. I've heard some people say, well, George Floyd had drugs in his system, he was a criminal. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he did beforehand. If he was in prison for his whole life until he got out that day, once a police officer has someone in custody and is under control, there's no excuse for what the officer did. Now, it's also tragic about what happened afterwards. I think we had a pretty large consensus after George Floyd's death around police reform. I think that most people agreed that the police are quite aggressive, and especially in certain communities, they're even more aggressive. I think that the majority of people would have and still do support some police reform, banning no-knock warrants, having a national police registry, so police officers that get fired in one department don't get hired almost immediately by another department. I think banning chokeholds is a good idea. Banning some other lethal force things, putting police more on a neutral standing instead of an aggressive standing, is a good idea. Where people lose me, especially the far left, is banning and abolishing the police. Now, what happens if you ban or abolish the police is nature abhors a vacuum, and so does society. So say Minneapolis goes through with their plan to abolish the police. What is going to happen is that there's not going to be no police. There's going to be some sort of policing in a different form. Now, what that form is going to be, we don't know. What we do know is that big companies are going to have their own private police forces. Small companies are probably going to band together and have their own police forces. Wealthy people are going to have their own police forces. Middle income communities might have their own neighborhood watch that becomes a police force. They might pay a company $10 or $20 a month to police their village or their town. Whatever happens, policing is going to get balkanized. And some of the ideas that the far left is coming out with, like, oh, we have to send social workers in instead of police. Social workers are all well and good after the fact. If you're having a domestic violence situation, I don't think a social worker is going to do any good. I don't think the social worker is going to want to be in that situation. I think afterwards, it's all fine and good. If you want to send a social worker in after they're at the police precinct and the situation has calmed down, send in the social worker, send in the psychologist. I would support that. But you can't replace the police with a social worker going into that situation. Now, we have some precedent of what happens without a independent police force. In the colonial period and a little bit afterwards, till about the 1820s or 30s, we did not have a independent police force. What people did and communities did was they would have the local militia take care of some of the law and order. They would have a constable and a night watchman. And the thing is, no one wanted to be a night watchman. They didn't wear badges. It wasn't a glamorous job. Some people volunteered, but if you volunteered, you might go and hang out with your buddies at the bar. Look for certain things, but it wasn't taken too seriously by most people. So what the municipality started doing was they started mandating that people go out and be night watchmen. That didn't work because they didn't really want to be there. They went and hung out with their buddies. So then they started to say, well, to criminals, it's part of your community service. You've got to be a night watchman. And you can probably tell how well that worked out. They would do the same thing. They would go out and sleep. They would do whatever. So eventually, and it still worked in a small community because you had the militias, and in a smaller community, people generally behave. There's social pressure to behave, but when communities and cities started getting bigger, the system started breaking down, and the first police forces were in Boston. Boston was one of the first police forces. Now, they formed a police force for two reasons. The local shipping companies were sick of paying for their own security, and there was immigration. The Irish invasion was happening. Lots and lots of Irish were flooding into cities. And they told the people, well, we can control the Irish and the foreign influence, and we can share the cost. And so local police forces were formed. Now, these police forces were absolutely terrible. They were handpicked by local political bosses, mayors, ward bosses, and they were basically hired thugs for whatever political party was in power. They would go intimidate their opponents. They would crack down on an opponent's business while leaving their allies' businesses alone. It was not a great system, not a good system. And it only got worse and worse until Prohibition, when it got totally out of hand. And that's when we got independent police forces. The independent police forces were there so they could police evenly. That's what they were supposed to do, instead of being in the pocket of a ward boss or a mayor. They were in the pocket of no one. And that was the reasoning for the type of policing we have today. A little bit aloof from the community, because they did not want the community to control them. And it has turned out that the police aren't really doing exactly what they were intended to do, but if it went back to total local control, I don't foresee good things happening. I think the same thing would happen where if you had a Democratic mayor or a Democratic city council, the police would be in the pocket of the Democrats. If it was a Republican-run city, the police would be in the pocket of the Republicans. So you're going to get a balkanized police force, which basically hurts the poor. The middle class will be okay. The wealthy will have their private security forces. The poor people will be either controlled by the criminal element, because there will be no policing, or they'll be controlled by the local police, and that usually doesn't turn out well. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the riots that happened afterwards. The problem with the riots is twofold. The first problem is when you burn down buildings and loot buildings, people are just saying, well, it's only property. It doesn't really matter. They're going to have insurance, and insurance is going to pay for everything, and everything's going to be great. They'll just rebuild in a few months or a year or two. It won't really affect the community too much. Yes, it will. A lot of businesses are not going to rebuild in that area. They're going to say, and they already have, they've already come out and said, I'm not rebuilding in Minneapolis. I'm going to build in another state. I'm going to build in another part of the city. I don't want to be in this neighborhood anymore. Some businesses will just never open again. They might not have insurance. They might say, oh, forget about it. And the businesses that do reopen, it's going to take quite a bit of time in order to rebuild the business. So and what happens is that people don't have places to shop. They don't have places to work. Housing prices go down, and the community becomes depressed, and it stays that way for a decade, maybe even more. No one wants to move there because they say, well, if I move there, I'm not safe. And it also has an effect of losing support for your cause. So whatever cause you're advocating for when you riot, people see the riot and they say, well, these people are crazy. They're burning down post offices. They're looting. They're, breaking windows. I don't support them. I don't support that. So you lose support automatically, and there's usually a backlash at the end of the riot. It's one of the reasons that Nixon got elected. There was major riots before the election, and there was a backlash against the rioters. I think the backlash is going to be a little bit delayed right now because there's a secondary thing going on, and that's you have to support Black Lives Matter. If you don't support Black Lives Matter, you're a racist, you're a phobe, you're a this, you get censored from social media. Now, I support Black Lives Matter in principle, I think Black Lives do matter, and I looked at their plank, and some of the things I support, and some of the things I don't support. I don't support their advocating abolishing the police, and they're not for the nuclear family. They are against Israel. So some of those things I don't support. But if I come out and say that, or people come out and say that, no one's going to go after me, because no one really is going to watch what I say. I've got 40 views at the most on my videos. But people come out and say it, and they're canceled automatically. They are either banned, or the Twitter mobs come after them if they say, well, I don't totally support Black Lives Matter, I only support them a little bit, or disagree with the mob. But the backlash is going to come. A lot of people aren't saying anything right now, but they will when this dies down, and there's going to be a backlash that is going to cancel many of the gains that Black Lives Matter might have made. And I think that's about it. Remember, never believe anybody's propaganda, not even your own. Thanks. Bye-bye.